Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on cotton profitability, plantation accounting, and violence as labor management. The core question is this: what kind of republic lets a profitable crop reorganize land, credit, law, and human bondage? The core competency is to explain the economic and social roots of the American slave system.
What kind of republic lets a profitable crop reorganize land, credit, law, and human bondage? By the early 19th century, slavery in the United States was moving into a new phase. Tobacco had already shaped older slave societies in Virginia and Maryland. Rice and indigo had anchored plantation life in South Carolina and Georgia, and sugar demanded brutal labor in Louisiana. After 1800, cotton transformed the scale of the system. Eli Whitney's cotton gin, introduced in the 1790s, made it easier to separate seeds from short staple cotton. Short staple cotton could grow across a wider interior zone than the long staple cotton of the Atlantic coast. That technical change expanded slavery because world demand was rising at the same time. British textile mills in Manchester needed raw fiber. Northern merchants, insurers, and shippers profited from carrying that fiber to market. Southern planters saw a path to extraordinary wealth if they could seize more land and command more labor. The result was the Cotton Kingdom. Cotton cultivation moved rapidly into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and eastern Texas. The federal government had already opened much of that land through survey, sale, treaty pressure, and native removal. A map of cotton expansion is also a map of state power. Surveyors measured land, speculators purchased tracts, county courts recorded deeds, and state governments protected slave property. The slave system did not spread through private desire alone. It spread through public structures that made land transfer, property registration, and legal enforcement predictable for slaveholders. Cotton profits changed the tempo of slavery. A successful planter could use one harvest to purchase more acreage, more enslaved people, more equipment, and more credit. That process multiplied quickly when prices were favorable. Cotton exports rose from modest early 19th century levels to the dominant American export crop by the 1830s and 1840s. The phrase King Cotton described that power in political language. Slaveholders believed cotton tied the South to Britain, tied Northern finance to Southern agriculture, and gave the slave states leverage in national politics. Their confidence rested on numbers: bales shipped, acres planted, prices quoted, debts extended, and labor routines tightened. This is the first root of the slave system that must remain clear. Slavery expanded because it paid. Men with money, land, and political influence had strong incentives to keep it expanding. They did not defend slavery out of habit alone. They defended it because the crop system they built around cotton made bondage profitable on a scale that reshaped the region. The Cotton Kingdom depended on land, but land alone could not produce wealth. Cotton required organized labor, and slaveholders treated enslaved people as the most valuable property in that labor system. Plantation books listed names, ages, sex, physical condition, purchase price, estimated productivity, and resale value. An enslaved man, woman, or child could be counted in an estate inventory, pledged as collateral for a loan, transferred in a marriage settlement, or sold to cover debt. The domestic slave trade turned that accounting language into a national market. After the federal ban on the Atlantic slave trade took effect in 1808, the internal trade grew larger. Traders purchased enslaved people in the Upper South and moved them south and west to the booming cotton lands. Virginia and Maryland exported enslaved labor through sale. New Orleans became one of the largest slave markets in North America. Buyers inspected teeth, muscles, scars, and posture in public auctions. Families could be divided because the market valued age, sex, skill, and expected output more than kinship. A child could be sold separately from a mother. A husband could be moved from Virginia to Mississippi while his wife remained behind. These separations were regular market practices inside a system that counted people as movable capital. Planter wealth often rested on credit rather than cash on hand. Cotton factors and commission merchants advanced goods and money against future crops. Banks and creditors accepted land and enslaved people as collateral. If a planter borrowed heavily in anticipation of a strong harvest, the pressure on enslaved labor increased because debt had to be serviced. The next crop was already spoken for in ledgers before it had been planted or picked. When prices fell or harvest disappointed, the owner might borrow again, intensify discipline, or sell people south to stabilize the books. That financial structure links slavery to wider markets. Northern banks, marine insurers, textile firms, and shipping houses helped turn cotton into cash. British demand drove exports. Southern planters used the proceeds to purchase imported goods, factory-made tools, and luxury items. The cotton economy was regional in labor law and national in commercial reach. That scale must be stated directly. Slavery stood in the South, but the money circuits touched docks, counting houses, mills, and banks far beyond any one plantation. OpenStax places heavy emphasis on this economic architecture because it explains why slavery did not fade as the Republic matured. A labor system tied to export profits, national credit, and international industry had defenders at many levels. That structure made moral challenge more difficult because too many institutions were making money from the arrangement. Plantation labor required daily supervision. Cotton fields had to be cleared, planted, weeded, picked, weighed, ginned, baled, and transported. Enslaved people performed that work under constant coercion. On large plantations, owners often relied on overseers to assign tasks, pace labor, punish disobedience, and report output. The overseer stood between the planter's ledger and the field hand's body. If the ledger set the expectation, the overseer enforced it. Gang labor dominated much of the Cotton South. Workers moved in supervised groups from first light to dark under a field driver or overseer. Picking season brought especially intense demands because wet weather spoiled fiber and missed market timing threatened profits. Some planters measured daily picking totals and compared workers against one another. A worker judged too slow might face whipping, extra tasks, confinement, or sale threats. Violence was a labor management system. It protected output, enforced hierarchy, and communicated that the owner's claim over a worker's hours and body would be total. Slave patrols reinforced plantation discipline beyond the field. White men searched roads, checked passes, broke up gatherings, and pursued runaways. County officials and militia systems supported this surveillance. Slave codes limited movement, literacy, assembly, weapon ownership, and testimony against white people. These laws varied by state, but they shared the same purpose: to define enslaved people as property, restrict independent action, and make public authority available to private masters. A planter did not stand alone. Sheriffs, patrols, courts, and legislatures stood behind him. Resistance never disappeared. Enslaved people slowed work, feigned illness, broke tools, stole food, preserved family ties, practiced religion, outside white supervision, learned secretly, and escaped when they could. Some revolted. Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831 killed dozens of white people and sent fear through the slave-holding South. Legislatures responded by tightening controls on movement, worship, and black literacy. The reaction exposes white authority because it shows white authorities understood the instability of the system. They did not answer fear with reform. They answered it with more surveillance and harsher law. Slaveholders also defended bondage through paternalism. They claimed that masters cared for dependent laborers the way a father supposedly cared for a family. That language hid sale, whipping, sexual exploitation, hunger, and forced labor behind a household story. It also gave elite whites a way to describe domination as duty. Paternalism worked politically because it let supporters present slavery as social order rather than organized theft. The domestic slave trade stripped that defense of its dignity. A system that could tear children from mothers to satisfy debt or move labor south for higher returns could not honestly describe itself as paternal care. The records of sale, transport, and mortgage make the contradiction plain. Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, provides a decisive source from below. Douglass was born into slavery in Maryland, witnessed whipping and deprivation, learned to read through extraordinary effort, and escaped north before publishing his narrative in 1845. His account restores human reality because it restores human reality to a system that preferred ledger, language, property language, and paternal language. Douglass wrote about hunger, fear, broken family ties, deliberate ignorance, and the corruption of masters who claimed moral authority while exercising domination. His narrative records moments that plantation books would never capture honestly: the sound of a beating, the uncertainty of parentage, the hunger of children, the anxiety of sale, the psychological pressure used to break a person's sense of self. A ledger could record an age and price. Douglass recorded what that classification felt like in lived experience. His narrative also shows slavery as a system of deliberate unmaking. Literacy is central here. Douglass understood that reading opened the possibility of thought beyond bondage and slaveholders understood the same truth from the other side. That is why Southern law and custom so often restricted black literacy after revolts and escape scares. Knowledge threatened control. A system that depends on force also depends on limiting the tools people might use to interpret and resist that force. One of Douglas's best-known lines appears near the end of his narrative. "You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man." The sentence names a process. Slavery was made through law, sale, discipline, and labor extraction. Freedom also had to be made through learning, flight, political speech, and community support. That line belongs beside the plantation system's economic machinery. Slaveholders talked as if bondage were natural. Douglas showed that the system had to be manufactured constantly. His account also undercuts paternalism with specific scenes. A man who starves workers, sells children, blocks literacy, or orders a beating is not acting as a guardian. He's protecting a labor investment. Douglas's testimony therefore works as a direct rebuttal to the pro-slavery language that circulated in sermons, legislative speeches, newspapers, and plantation households. The economic and social roots of slavery lay in the convergence of cotton profits, land expansion, credit dependence, racial ideology, and legal enforcement. Cotton made the system lucrative. State power opened new land. Banks and merchants extended the credit that kept plantations running. Slave codes, patrols, and county courts protected ownership claims. Paternalist arguments gave moral cover to people who wanted to see themselves as orderly householders rather than as labor exploiters. That convergence made slavery durable, but it also made the system unstable in a deeper way. Every favorable cotton season encouraged expansion and debt. Every debt cycle increased pressure on labor. Every act of resistance increased white fear and surveillance. Every sale exposed the lie that slavery preserved stable households. Every first-person account like Douglas's forced Americans to hear what their export economy was buying. The system could grow because it was profitable, and it had to be policed constantly because the people inside it never accepted bondage willingly. The structure must remain in view. The slave system was not a residue from colonial days waiting to disappear. It was a modern commercial regime built into the 19th century republic. It connected field labor to Atlantic textile demand, local sheriffs to state codes, mortgage paper to family separation, and county patrols to global commodity markets. A bale of cotton carried the labor of people who had been priced, supervised, punished, and denied legal personhood. That is the judgment problem the secession crisis requires. Which route carried the most force? Cotton profitability, credit and accounting, legal protection, or violence as labor management? The strongest answer will connect all four. Cotton created the hunger for expansion. Accounting made that expansion financeable. Law made it enforceable. Violence made it work day by day. Remove any one piece and the system weakens. Keep them together, and slavery becomes both immensely productive and immensely destructive. The social order built on those foundations reached beyond any single plantation. Poor white farmers might own no slaves and still defend the system because it organized racial hierarchy and promised them a place above black laborers. Politicians defended slavery because it supported property and party power. Ministers defended it because scripture could be read selectively in service of order. Merchants defended it because the crop paid. Those overlapping interests help explain why slavery survived so long in a republic that praised liberty constantly. The same overlap also explains why the conflict ahead became national. A system built this deeply into wealth and law was never going to disappear quietly. Once large numbers of Americans began challenging slavery as a moral wrong and a political danger, they were challenging the economic root structure of the South and the commercial comfort of many people outside it. The coming Civil War cannot be explained without first understanding what slavery had become by the 1850s, a profitable labor empire defended by books, courts, patrols, and force. Cotton profits linked plantation coercion to banks, shippers, insurers, and global textile demand on a scale too large to dismiss as local habit. The harder judgment is what kind of republic accepts commercial success, built so openly on price bodies, county violence, and legal denial of personhood. Once that structure is visible, the coming conflict looks less like surprise than like delayed reckoning.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.